Right. So many of these sectors still rely on heavily on coal, and finding viable alternatives has become urgently important. That's where biomass comes in. It's not just a cleaner fuel, but as a pathway for carbon finance. In fact, Pakistan has started laying the groundwork for this shift. Just a few months ago, during COP29 in Baku, the Ministry of Climate Change launched Pakistan's first ever climate policy guidelines for trading in the carbon market. It provides a formal framework both for the VCM and compliance-based carbon trading, and it aligns with the global standards. So today we'll understand what role biomass can play in this transition, what kinds of biomass projects are eligible for carbon credits, and most importantly, how businesses can build viable carbon credit projects around fuel switching and waste recovery. So Pakistan's agricultural sector produces a huge amount of leftover material. Crop residues like wheat straw, rice husk, bagasse, cotton stalks, that often goes to waste. But these are all valuable sources of biomass fuel. And what's interesting is that this shift toward biomass hasn't been random. Like I said, it's been shaped by rising fossil fuel costs, better boiler technologies becoming mainstream, and a stronger sense of responsibility to cut industrial emissions. Local availability and improved supply chain mechanics of agri residues have further accelerated the momentum. So if you look at the timeline, until around 2020, we saw pilot projects, retrofits, and early experiments in the industrial setting. By 2024, the supply chains had matured a bit more, and the shift was no longer experimental. It was becoming a real energy strategy. And now from 2025 onwards, we're entering a phase where industries are not just switching fuels, but they're also asking, can we generate carbon credits from this switch? Can we monetize the emission reductions? So industries like cement, steel, and textiles still rely heavily on coal, right? That's a challenge, but also a big opportunity. They are high energy users, and a transition to biomass can meaningfully reduce emissions while generating revenue from the offsets. So just to give you a sense of scale, Pakistan's total biomass residue potential is estimated at over 50 million tons per year. That's a lot of untapped energy just waiting to be converted to low carbon steam, heat, and electricity. And now with the global carbon markets more accessible, there's a real chance to make this transition financially attractive. All right, then, let's talk about the path from biomass use to carbon offsets. You'll notice on this slide that there are 6 types of biomass feedstocks listed, but for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to focus on the first 4: dedicated energy crops, forestry residues, agro-industrial waste, and harvest residues. So we're not going to animal manure or MSW today, not because they're irrelevant, but because they're usually better suited for methane capture projects like biogas or landfill gas recovery. Those fall under different carbon methodologies and have strict implementation needs. Now, why focus on the first 4? Firstly, these sources are abundant and renewable. Pakistan's energy sector produces, like I said, huge volumes of residues, rice husk, wheat straw, sugarcane bagasse, all of which can be used as a clean energy source without disrupting the food production. Then there's the carbon benefit. Burning biomass emits about 94 kilograms of CO2 per gigajoule, whereas coal emits about 101 kg per gigajoule. And this might not sound like much, but across large energy system, this difference adds up, especially if the biomass would have otherwise decayed and released methane or CO2. And of course, this helps us reduce the dependence on imported fuels. It improves energy security, stabilizes cost, and of course, there's the financial incentive. So verified carbon offsets can be sold in the voluntary carbon market. But let's also be realistic. Not every biomass project qualifies for carbon credits, even if it's replacing fossil fuels. Many of the project proponents in Pakistan are eager to tap into this opportunity, but they run into barriers that prevent them from monetizing emission reductions. So let's break down these barriers. Firstly is the technical and operational challenges. So some projects use poorly designed or retrofitted boilers. These systems have low efficiency, burning maybe 350 kg of biomass to produce just 1 ton of steam, when modern systems can do it with less than 250 kg. Ash buildup on heat exchangers is another issue. It chokes performance, increases fuel consumption, and then these efficiencies reduce the net emission reductions, which directly affects credit eligibility and volume. And the carbon credit standards require robust, verifiable performance data, but many local projects lack structural MRV to meet the reporting rigor that is expected by the international registries. Then we have the high upfront costs. Even if a project is technically eligible, the capital investment for efficient biomass systems, along with the cost of project registration, validation, and monitoring, can be a barrier. Unless carbon revenues are clearly projected and accessible, many proponents struggle to justify this assessment. And we can discuss this in depth in a bit about how to solve this one. Finally, we have policy and institutional weaknesses. Pakistan still lacks enforced boiler efficiency standards, so subpar systems continue to operate. There is a lack of targeted incentives, so for industries to shift from fossil fuels to high performance biomass setups, that slows adoption and undermines the case for creditworthiness. But despite all this, has this been done before? So I'm going to walk you through the case of one of Pakistan's first large-scale industrial biomass offset projects. And this one comes from Engro Fertilizers, a well-known name in the industry. In 2022, they set up a greenfield rice processing plant in District Nowshera, KP. Their idea was fairly simple. Instead of running the plant on fossil fuels, they decided to go all in with biomass boiler systems using local agricultural waste, mainly rice husk, as fuel. Now, what makes this project significant is that it was designed from day one with carbon credit generation in mind. That's quite rare in Pakistan. It wasn't a retrofit. It was a planned low carbon facility. Engro registered this project under the CDM and applied a methodology which covers thermal energy production using renewable biomass. The goal was to replace fossil fuel derived steam with steam from a 3.5 ton per hour biomass boiler. And the numbers here, they speak for themselves. The project had estimated reductions of about 38,600 tons of CO2 equivalent each year. So over a 10-year crediting period, that adds up to nearly 386,000 tons of avoided emissions. And even at a conservative $5 per credit, assuming $5 per credit, that's still a potential revenue stream of about $1.6 million and significantly more if the prices rise. So another example worth highlighting is from Sapphire Fibers Limited, based in Faisalabad. This project involved a complete fuel switch from fossil fuels like furnace oil and coal to biomass for thermal energy. Sapphire installed a biomass-fired boiler system to generate steam for their industrial processes using locally available agricultural residues as well. And what makes this case interesting is that the system wasn't a minor retrofit. It was a complete operational shift with the goal of carbon credit generation in mind. And so fully replacing fossil-derived steam, the project qualified for a crediting period of over 10 years. And it's a good example of how the textile sector, which typically doesn't get associated with carbon offsets the same way as highly as coal-dependent industries, can also benefit from the VCM if the technical planning and documentation are aligned from the start. So the next example comes from our next door neighbor, India, and it's one of hundreds of similar biomass projects that have been successfully registered and over the last 2 decades, in fact. And it's worth reflecting on how similar our economies are and agricultural landscapes are. Like Pakistan, India has abundance of agricultural residues and a large number of small to medium-sized industrial units that depend on fossil fuels for heat and steam. The challenges are familiar too: price volatility, energy insecurity, and the need to decarbonize. This particular project was implemented at a rice mill in India's Punjab, where the proponents installed a biomass boiler that runs entirely on rice husk. It replaced fossil fuel-derived steam used in processing with steam generated from the mill's own waste. And the project was registered until CDM using a methodology that supports small-scale thermal energy generation through renewable biomass. And over its 10-year crediting period, the project reduced around 8,500 tons of CO2 equivalent annually. While the scale seems modest, the project demonstrates what's possible even when technical readiness, local resource use, and carbon finance are just aligned. It's a model that has been replicated across many Indian states, often by mill owners or SMEs with support from local consultants and credit aggregators. And the lesson here is that the same stats are not out of reach for Pakistan. We have the same biomass, same boiler technologies, and comparable industrial setups. And what's been missing so far is the ecosystem to support and scale. So we've now seen that the potential is real and that it's already being realized both in Pakistan and across the region. So the next logical question is, how do you actually assess if a biomass project is eligible or viable for carbon credits? So on the left here, this is what we call a baseline scenario. Fossil fuels being used to generate steam or heat in industrial processes. That is the business as usual. And here we have the project scenario, a biomass boiler supplying the same thermal energy, but with lower net emissions. You replace a high emission fuel like coal with a lower emission alternative like biomass. And the difference in emissions between these two is your emission reduction. And that's what can be quantified and sold as a carbon credit. The emissions you avoid by making that switch, that's what that counts. And 1 ton of CO2 avoided equals 1 carbon offset. Once verified, these credits can be sold in the VCM to buyers who need to offset their emissions, like tech giants, international brands, airlines, even fossil fuel giants themselves. And this is a performance-based system, so you get rewarded for every ton of emissions that you avoid as long as you can prove it. So now that we understand the principles, let's look at what type of biomass projects typically qualify. So biomass power plants, heat generation facilities, off-grid or hybrid biogas units, waste to energy, CHPs, and the typical applications are industrial boilers, cement kilns, brick manufacturing, and we also see them in textile dyeing units, food processing facilities, and even pulp and paper mills, anywhere that relies heavily on process heat. So this makes biomass a particularly relevant option for Pakistan industrial base, where many of these sectors are already looking for a cleaner, cost-stable energy alternatives. However, there's a catch with these projects as well. First, the biomass must be renewable and sustainably sourced. That means that no deforestation, no use of wood from unknown or unsustainable sources, agricultural residues, sawdust, and processing waste. They're usually fine as long as they're not diverted from an existing use like animal feed or compost. Also, the project must demonstrate additionality. In simple terms, this means the switch to biomass wouldn't have happened anyway without the carbon credit incentive. If it's already a business as usual case, then it's not eligible. And we'll look at the project registration mechanism in a bit, but before we go any further, I want to pause a bit on the slide and make a point. So carbon credit registration is not cheap. Between validation, verification, third-party audits, monitoring systems, and registry fees, the total cost can easily exceed $100,000, and that is before any credits are issued. So before launching a pilot or making any on-ground investment, it's critical to ask, is this project even viable for carbon credits? And this is where a feasibility study comes in. This is more than a desk research, right? It is a proper carbon feasibility assessment that helps you identify whether your biomass type and technology are eligible, if the baseline scenario can be clearly established, how much CO2 you're likely to reduce annually, and whether the expected volume of credits justify these costs. What risks, technical, financial, regulatory, might walk your path later. And without this initial step, you could end up spending a large sum on documentation and registration, only to find out that your project won't qualify or won't generate enough credits to be financially worthwhile. And in our experience, many good technical projects fall through at the registration stage simply because viability was never tested upfront. And this is what makes this an essential step, not just optional. It protects your investment and helps structure the project properly from the beginning. We designed this practical 11 parameters checklist to sufficiently guide your decisions on whether to proceed, scale back, or restructure your project. So I'll quickly break down each of these, hopefully. The first is project eligibility. This is where you ask, does my project actually qualify under any existing carbon standards? So for example, if you're setting a biomass boiler to replace coal in a textile unit, you would ask, does a methodology exist that applies to this scenario? Then comes the question of additionality. Would you have done this project anyway? So if the answer is yes, say because there's suddenly a change in law and it's forcing you to, the project might not be considered additional, and that can be a deal breaker. You'll also need to check where your project is located and whether the sector qualifies under the chosen carbon program. And lastly, the technology itself, it has to fit. A modern biomass boiler using agricultural waste is generally fine, but if you're using something unusual like backyard retrofitting your existing one or mixing fuel types, that could get tricky. Next is project baseline. Here you're basically building a before and after picture. What would emissions look like if you didn't do the project? So for example, your factory was running on furnace oil before the switch. You'd calculate how much CO2 that was producing per ton of steam. That becomes your baseline. But you need evidence to support this. That means fuel invoices, operational logs, energy bills, something that proves your system was fossil fuel based before. And if you're setting up a new greenfield plant, then you'll need to justify what the likely fuel choice would have been in the absence of your project. Next is legal compliance. This is mostly about making sure there are no ownership issues or regulatory gaps. So for instance, if you're operating a boiler inside a factory, but your energy supply is managed by a third party, you'll need to be very clear about who owns the emission reductions. If you can't prove that, then you can't claim the credits. Also, you need to make sure all permits and licenses are in place. So for example, environmental NOCs to boiler certifications, even though carbon markets aren't governed by national laws, they do expect your project to be fully compliant with local and national regulations. Lastly, there's the question of environmental and social safeguards. If your project affects nearby communities or involves land use changes, then you'll need to show that you're not causing any unintended harm. Next is financial feasibility. This is where a lot of projects start to look shaky. You'll want to weigh your total project cost, installation, documentation, validation, against the revenue that you can realistically expect from the credits. This means reviewing the current price per carbon credit, but also considering how many tons of CO2 you'll reduce annually. And if the math doesn't work out, the project probably isn't worth registering. And it's not just about break even. You'll want a revenue model that is attractive enough to justify the effort and carry the project through over several years. Then we have project timelines. These need to be clear from day one. So when will the implementation begin? When will commissioning happen? And importantly, when will the credits start to be generated? This affects cash flows and investor interest. So if you're only expecting credits 3 or 4 years down the line, you'll need a plan to sustain the project in the meantime. Most standards allow a crediting period of about 10 years. Minimum is 7, I think, but that only starts after registration and successful validation. So the earlier you plan this out, the smoother the path will be. Next is monitoring and verification. Carbon credits are only issued when your emission reductions are proven. And that means having a proper monitoring plan from day one. You'll need to define what data you'll collect. So for example, how much biomass is consumed, how much steam is produced, what fuel is being displaced. These metrics must line up with your chosen methodology. So just installing a boiler is not enough. You'll also need a data management system, some way to record, store, organize this information so it's accessible when the auditors come in. And that brings us to third-party verification, your crediting body, whether it's Vera, CDM, Gold Standard, they will assign an independent auditor to verify these results later when you register. So your monitoring plan at this stage has to be audit ready for that. Then we have sustainability and co-benefits. Carbon projects are fast becoming beyond just emission mitigation projects, right? Many standards now expect you to demonstrate positive side effects, and that's what we call co-benefits. So for biomass projects, this could be environmental, for example, so reduced waste burning in Pakistan, for example, improves air quality, better residue management, or social counts things like job creation for biomass collection, improved energy access, or reduced exposure to harmful smoke. And this improves your project's marketability, in fact, especially if you're selling to buyers who prioritize SDG-linked credits. Next, we have risk mitigation. So no project is risk-free, and carbon buyers are very aware of that. You'll need to account for technical risks. So what if the boiler doesn't perform as expected, or maintenance costs spiral? Regulatory risks. What if national fuel subsidies change or carbon market policies shift? And market risks, which means carbon credit prices may fluctuate and demand can change. So if your project depends highly on like high prices to even break even, that's a risk that you'll want to highlight and plan for. Stakeholder engagement. So even for industrial projects like biomass fuel switch, you can't ignore your surroundings. And if you're sourcing your biomass from local farmers or burning it on site or changing waste flows, then local communities are a part of your project, whether you engage them or not. So it's much better to bring them in early, explain what you're doing, and hear their concerns, make sure there are no surprises during the validation process. And also think about who else can support your project, whether it's government departments, NGOs, or academic institutions. Their involvement, either formally or as supporters, can help strengthen your case during both documentation and stakeholder consultations. Then we have carbon standards requirements. Of course, each registry, whether it's Vera, Gold Standard, or ICR, has a different process. All of them require a PDD, right? A clear and complete documentation for your project, but then it has to be aligned with the specific methodology of that standard. And if you're not familiar with the steps, it's best to work with someone who is, because getting this part wrong will mean that you can miss out on actual costs that your credits may be worth. And finally, we have long-term viability. Now remember, carbon projects aren't a one-time effort, right? You're committing to monitoring and reporting performance for 7 to 10 years, maybe longer. And that means your equipment must keep working efficiently, your data must stay accurate and accessible, and your reporting must continue to meet the standards expectations. And projects that fail in years 3 or 4 often do so because they didn't plan for the long-term operational and reporting load. So that's the last box. And though it's the quietest, it's one of the most important. This slide gives us a bird's eye view of what a complete biomass carbon project actually looks like from concept to credit scale. And I've split this into 3 layers to help you visualize how project development, carbon registration, and credit monetization run in parallel, but they also intersect. So at the top, we have the physical project development. This is your real world infrastructure, starting with the concept and then feasibility stage, financing, construction, and operations. This is what most industries are already familiar with, right? But if you're considering carbon credits, the carbon development pathway needs to start in parallel, right from the feasibility stage, not just after construction. That's the middle track. Here, you're aligning your project with a carbon methodology. You're doing consultations, validating the design, registering it with a standard like Vera or a gold standard, and then setting up your monitoring system. This part ensures that once your plant is running, you're actually eligible to earn credits. And notice how the arrows cut across. Feasibility studies feed into carbon design. Financing relies on registration potential, and project operation is where you start monitoring performance. And then at the bottom is where the money comes in, the carbon commercialization. Once your credits are verified and issued, you enter the market to find buyers, negotiate a term sheet, go through due diligence, and sign an ERP. ERP is emission reduction purchase agreement. That's what leads to the revenue from selling your credits. So this is what we call a cycle, right? Because each layer supports the other. If you skip carbon planning early on, you risk building a plant that's ineligible for credits. If you delay commercialization steps, you may be setting on verified credits with no one to buy them. So the goal is to think of these streams as integrated tracks. This is a quick snapshot of what the carbon credit generation cycle actually looks like. So you start with the feasibility study, followed by the project design, aligned with the methodology. That moves into validation by a third party, and then registration and implementation. Once the system is up and running, you enter the monitoring phase, which leads into issuance and sale of credits. And then this loop continues every year. Now I mentioned this before, but it's important to keep this in mind that the whole process can take up to a year and a half, maybe 2 years. 2 years is like the absolute maximum. And the cost can be up to $100,000, maybe even more, depending on the scale and the complexity of your project. So this is a serious commitment, right? But with the right setup, it can also be a long-term revenue stream. And this slide shows just a few examples of carbon methodologies that apply to biomass projects across different standards. You see options under GCC, Vera, Gold Standard, and CDM. They have their own set of criteria depending on whether you're generating electricity, heat, or switching fuels. So for example, the Vera one used for combined heat and power, while the GCC one is for industrial fuel switch. But these are just a few of all the available options, right? Depending on your technology, fuel source, and sector, there can be other active methodologies that suit your project even better. So for example, feedstock in pulp and paper, cardboard, there's a specific methodology for that one too under Vera. And this is why a feasibility at this stage is so important. It helps match your project to the right methodology early on, so you're not backtracking later. This next section is all about the business case. What are biomass credits worth, and what kind of price trends are we seeing in the market today? So since 2005, over 223 projects have had credits issued under this category. And today they've generated a cumulative 59 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And as you can see in the graph, issuances really picked up around 2020 and peaked in 2021 with nearly 10 million credits issued that year alone. And that's largely because many industrial facilities globally were moving away from coal and furnace oil, and they were actively leveraging carbon finance to do it. But you'll also notice there's a drop in the last couple of years. And that's not because the project stopped. It's more due to delays in credit issuances, changes in verification cycles, and some uncertainty in the global carbon markets post 2022. Still, the volume that you see here clearly tells us that biomass fuel switch is not a fringe idea. It's a mature, recognized category with strong carbon market relevance. And there's room for more, especially in regions in Pakistan where the industrial base is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So let's talk about this chart and what this number really means. The graph here shows the volume-weighted average carbon credit price for fuel switch projects over the past year. And as of the last 4 weeks, it's hovering around $5.4 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? But it's important to understand what kind of projects this average includes, right? This price mostly reflects credits from renewable energy in the fuel switch project. So, which is where biomass typically falls. But the key takeaway here is that projects like solar or wind, which are already considered business as usual in many regions, they don't usually command high prices on the carbon market anymore. And that's why they're often shifted towards IREX as well, because instead of carbon credits, because they don't really go for that well prices. Biomass is different because in many cases it's replacing coal or furnace oil in hard to abate industries. Plus, it often comes with co-benefits, just like we talked about. So cleaner air at the local level, utilization of agricultural waste, job creation in fuel sourcing, reductions in landfill pressure, or like even open burning. And these co-benefits add value. As a result, biomass-linked credits often trade at a premium compared to the market average that you see here. So while $5.4 is a useful benchmark, a well-structured biomass project can earn more, especially if it demonstrates a strong impact across multiple SDGs. Now, even if your project qualifies and you're issued carbon credits, the next big question is, what are they actually worth? So unlike traditional commodities, carbon credit pricing doesn't follow a single market rate. It varies depending on several moving parts. So who's buying it? What kind of credit is it? And how is the market trending? That's why it's not always possible to say a biomass carbon credit is worth X dollars. Instead, it depends on things like who the buyer is. A compliance buyer may value it differently than a voluntary corporate buyer. You can ask like where the demand is coming from. Some markets value energy transition, other prioritize co-benefits. What the credit looks like on paper. Is it recent? Is it verified? Does it have sustainable development benefits? And of course, when you sell it, uh, when will you do that? Because the future value can shift due to regulations, oversupply, or even global ESG trends. So all of this makes pricing unpredictable unless you have like a clear carbon roadmap in place, like we discussed earlier. A good roadmap is it looks at your project's own volume, type, and timing, and helps you understand your revenue potential. And at this stage, we can ask you, do you have a biomass system in place already? Are you planning a fuel switch soon? Because if the answer is yes, this is exactly the right moment to start structuring it for carbon credits. And yet Resources Future have the capacity to guide your investment plans exactly through the 11 parameter carbon roadmap that we just discussed. We look at the full picture from legal ownership and monitoring frameworks all the way up to stakeholder partnerships and long-term credibility under evolving carbon market rules. So whether you're still deciding if your project qualifies or you're trying to evaluate the revenue potential before moving forward, this is where we come in. And if you move one step further, our team is equipped. Is my slide changing? I think. Yes. Yeah. So our team is equipped to support the full journey from early pre-feasibility assessments to registration and credit issuance. So I'll stop here and we can take some questions or insights, or if anyone has a comment, I'll pause here. So I'm just reading the comments. The estimated emissions for coal versus biomass. So coal, this is my research. Coal was about 101 kg of CO2 per gigajoule, and biomass is 94 kg per gigajoule. But obviously, this is an average because it also depends on what kind of fuel that you're talking about. So I'm not sure. I don't think that there are any reliefs or subsidies for biomass as of yet. Um, Hi, Nazim. Why are we assuming $5 credit? Is there any standard price? I just assumed $5 because that is a very minimum conservative estimate, right? I just wanted to give you an overview about the possible generation, the possible revenue. This is obviously higher than $5 because, like I said, the fuel switch projects are not really attracting as much the credit value because of their co-benefits, but that's not the case for biomass. So it's probably higher than $5 per credit. Do any cement plants have carbon credits? So yeah, there were a couple of projects under CDM. Um, there are many abroad. There are many examples. As Sapphire project monetized. Um, this is probably not disclosed yet. Hi, Kashif. You want to register your hydropower project, right? So I think we can get in touch. You can drop me an email. I'll give it here in the chat box, and we can link up and see if this can be a project. Yeah, CDM is an old standard. There are not any examples as of yet because there are still changes to the methodology. Vera recently scrapped their biomass one, and it's working on a new methodology for I think it's been a while. So I think even if there are any carbon projects, they're probably in their validation stage at this point. This was in response to your question that CDM is an old standard. Hanan asked, is this where our gold standard? This was CDM. Yes, so 100K, you're asking, Abdul Hanan is here, is asking if 100K includes all costs, including validation consultation for the first year. Yes, that is just for the first year. While you're registering, while you're having a third-party auditor for validation of your project, this is just for the first year. Mohammed Bilal is asking if a company installs a biomass system to replace coal, can they use the resulting carbon credits for their own use? Definitely, you can do that, but I don't see the financial sense in doing so because we're not really having a carbon tax at the moment, right? So nobody is actually forcing you to reduce your emissions. It makes better sense if you can sell these credits at a very good price to buyers who are willing to pay for their offsets. So until there are no laws or regulations, I think it would make sense for you to sell the credits as well. But of course, you can show them as your own emission offsets. Hi, Essen, from ALSCAS. He's asking that he is currently supplying biomass as I think to cement and textile sectors in Pakistan. I'd like to ask for companies that have already installed biomass boilers or are using biomass in their processes but didn't register at the time of installation. Is there still a way for them to benefit from carbon credits now? If so, what steps should they take? So I talked about this. This is it is generally better for you to have like a recent project. It shouldn't be very old because the credits don't hold the same value. If your reports are like, let's say from 2015 or earlier, that makes it a bit difficult to actually verify them. We can still try and look into this, but usually what we advise is a scale-up plan. So for example, if you're already doing this, maybe carbon finance can help you scale up. But then again, it's best to have like a pre-feasibility done before you actually go for it. So this will give you a better idea of how much your credits can go for. Nadia Iqbal is asking which VVB are operating in Pakistan. So these bodies are operating globally, so they're not country specific, and this is the voluntary carbon market, so anybody can partake in them. Nazim Ali is asking what about negative impacts of biomass burning? For example, black carbon emissions. Would it be part of the feasibility? Other installations are needed to filter black carbon. Yes, of course. So when you're doing a calculation of your emissions, you have to account for all the emissions, right? So this is why we're calling them like a fuel switch project, because you still will have the emissions, but the difference in the emissions is going to be enough that it's going to count as a carbon offset, and you can sell these offsets as a carbon credit. Adil Javed asked why manure is not under consideration in this presentation. Hopefully, we'll do another one soon. Manure is not included in this because it has like a different methodology. It's better to consider manure under a methane project because I'm sure most of you are aware that methane is a much more deadlier gas. It is like, I think sometimes it's quoted 21%, 21 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And I've even seen the figure rise up to 29. So that means if a carbon dioxide offset is, let's say, one, a methane one would be that many times much higher, right? So that makes it a more financially sound project. Like you would get a much higher quality, a much higher priced carbon credit for a methane project. Naveed Afzal is asking if solar and wind generation can be carbon projects. So like I said, they don't really fetch the carbon credit price as high as they used to because this is becoming business as usual. So there's no need for carbon finance in such projects anymore. So we have like something else that is called the IREX. And I just want to give a heads up that while there's like a lot of supply for IREX, there's not enough demand, especially in Pakistan. So we would also have to look into that. Anya Abasi is asking, can the companies register themselves for carbon reduction projects credits, or do they need to hire a third party for this? No, there's no compulsion. If you have the internal capacity to do all these emission reduction quantifications, and you have the capacity to write a PDD, you have the capacity to financially model this yourself, then obviously you can do that, but it's better to have somebody who is experienced in the market. So they can give you a better idea about the financial, since that would make the return on your carbon revenues. Thank you all. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to email us and we'll get back to you. Before I end the presentation and wrap up, I just wanted to give you a sneak peek on our upcoming webinar. So if you're keen to keep up with building your expertise, don't miss out on this upcoming interactive session on IFRS 1 and 2. We'll be walking through disclosure standards and using scenario-based exercises to help you apply them in the real-world context. So save the date, May 13th. All details will also be on our platforms, and we hope to see you there. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much.